May God bless your time with all goodness and affection. Welcome to the I Know More channel. Our story today is titled The Minister's Daughter and the Poor Porter. It is one of the exciting and interesting stories. I hope you like it. It is said that in ancient times there was a poor woman who lost her husband at a young age, leaving behind a young boy named Shaheen. Life was harsh on her. Her husband passed away suddenly, leaving her to face the storms of time and its worries alone. Her only concern was to raise Shaheen, that little child who became the focus of her entire life. The days of mourning passed, but they did not last long, as she quickly returned to the routine of life between sewing clothes and working in homes. Her days were difficult, full of toil and fatigue, but she endured all of that with the patience and tenderness of a mother, striving not to make Shaheen feel any deficiency or need. Years passed, and Shaheen grew up into a young man carrying in his heart dreams greater than his reality. One day, while he was working as a porter in the market, his attention was drawn to a luxurious carriage stopping in the middle of the crowd. The horses pulling it were decorated with golden ribbons, radiating luxury and majesty. From the carriage, a girl got out who dazzled everyone with her beauty. Her eyes were like pearls, and her gaze seemed to carry a mysterious secret. Shaheen could not take his eyes off her. Her beauty was enchanting, attracting hearts and taking breaths away. His curiosity pushed him to ask one of the passers-by about her identity. Suddenly, the answer that inflamed his heart was that she was Hasna, the daughter of the country's minister. At that moment, Shaheen felt something he had never known before, a violent love, like a storm. Despite his knowledge of the big difference between them, his heart did not back down. One night, while he was deep in sleep, he had a strange dream. He saw himself at a big wedding surrounded by people congratulating him. Next to him was Hasna, wearing a wedding dress, smiling at him. From afar, his late father was watching with tenderness and contentment. Shaheen woke up from his sleep, his heart filled with joy and turmoil. He turned to find his mother sitting next to him, preparing pancakes by the light of the lamp. He reached out and took a piece, then asked her in a calm but decisive tone, "Mother, may I ask you something?" She looked at him with a smile that hid deep concern and said, "Of course, my son. What do you want to ask for?" Shaheen was silent for a moment, the words heavy on his lips. Then he spoke firmly, "I want you to propose to Hasna, the minister's daughter." The mother froze in place, and the pastries almost fell from her hand. She stared at him in astonishment and said, "Are you crazy, Shaheen? Do you know what you're saying?" But he answered her with a confident look, "Yes, I know what I'm saying. I want her to be my wife." The mother tried to dissuade him, saying in a desperate tone, "My son, we are poor, and we don't have anything. How can you ask for the hand of the minister's daughter? This is impossible." But he insisted stubbornly, "I won't hear you object. You have to go and ask her father for her hand." The mother stood confused, her heart struggling between her love for her son and her fear of humiliation. But with the passage of time and Shaheen's insistence, she found herself agreeing, despite all her fears, to take this impossible path. The mother walked with steps weighed down with worries toward the minister's house. The road was long and seemed to get more difficult with every step she took. She reached the luxurious door. The servant received her with a scrutinizing look and asked in a formal tone, "What do you need here?" The mother swallowed her saliva hesitantly and said in a low voice, "I want to see my lady, the minister's wife." She was allowed entry into the spacious guest room, where the walls were covered with luxurious fabrics, and the furniture shone under the light of the lamps. The minister's wife entered with a formal smile and gestured for her to sit. "Welcome. Come in." The mother sat nervously, gripping the edge of her dress. After a moment of hesitation, she said, "I won't take long. I came to ask for the hand of your daughter, Hasna, for my son, Shaheen." The minister's wife was silent and stared at the mother with eyes carrying a mixture of astonishment and pity. After a long moment, she said with a faint smile, "Why not?" Then she got up suddenly, without adding a word, and left the room. The mother waited a long time, but the minister's wife did not return. Instead, the servant came carrying a small amount of money and said coldly, "This is from my lady. I will take you to the door." The mother felt an insult sinking in her heart, as if she had been exposed to charity, not a marriage proposal. She left the palace, hiding her tears, and returned home with heavy steps. There she found Shaheen waiting for her eagerly. She sat in front of him and told him in a broken voice, "Did you see, my son? They treated me like a slave. It was as if I asked for something I had no right to." But her words did not deter Shaheen, but rather ignited the fires of determination in his heart. Sadness overcame him, so he moved away from everyone and sat in a dark corner, reviewing himself. He slept there. In his sleep, the dream visited him again. He saw himself holding the hand of a beautiful woman, staring into her eyes and feeling the heat of her breath close to him. When he woke up, the decision had been established in his heart. He returned to his mother and said in a tone full of defiance, "If you do not go to the minister again, I will not return here. I will not allow this idea to die." The mother tried to dissuade him and said sadly, "My son, do you think that life is easy for us? Why do you increase its burdens?" But Shaheen answered insistently, "If I do not marry a beautiful woman, then this is my destiny, and I will not give it up." The mother felt that her son's words were tearing her soul from the pain, but she could not bear to see him like this after a bitter internal struggle. She gathered her courage again and decided to go again to the minister's house, this time determined to return empty-handed. At the decorated door, the servant stood sternly and asked the mother in a dry voice, "What do you want this time?" The mother raised her head and looked at him with a firmness she had never known in herself before, and said decisively, "I want to meet my lady, the minister's wife." Moments did not pass until the minister's wife came wearing a luxurious silk caftan embroidered with golden threads. Her features reflected astonishment mixed with curiosity as she looked at the poor woman who had returned again. She asked her in a hesitant tone, "What do you want now?" The mother gathered her strength and said in a firm voice that concealed her pain, "I came to ask for the hand of your daughter, Hasna, for Ibn Shaheen." The minister's wife raised her eyebrows in astonishment, as if the request had exceeded all her expectations. She was silent for a moment, thinking, then said, "This matter is not in my hands. If your son wants to marry my daughter, he must go to her father himself and ask for her hand from him." The meeting ended quickly, and the mother bid her farewell with heavy steps, feeling as if she had just emerged from a battle. The loser returned home carrying a heavy burden in her chest. The next morning, Shaheen was standing in front of her, his eyes full of determination and anxiety. He asked her in a calm tone that carried buried tension, "Mom, what happened with the minister's wife?" The mother sighed and answered in a broken voice while looking at the ground. "She told me that you should go to her father yourself and ask for her hand." Shaheen was silent for a moment, then said in a firm tone, "Okay, I will go to him tomorrow morning. I have no choice but to try." The next morning, Shaheen woke up before sunrise and prepared himself in his simplest clothes, but his heart was wearing the greatest courage. He went out heading to the minister's house, where he waited a long time until the minister finished his business and gave him permission to enter. Finally, Shaheen entered the spacious hall where the minister stood, a majestic man with the majesty of authority and the wrinkles of years, looking at him with a scrutinizing look. Shaheen came forward with apparent confidence that concealed his anxiety and said, "Mr. Minister, I came to ask for the hand of your daughter, Hassan Na." The minister raised his eyebrows in surprise, then said in a voice that carried a mixture of astonishment and contempt, "I have never seen you before." "Tell me who your father is," Shaheen answered firmly. "My father was Salem, a simple laborer who farmed people's lands, but he died a long time ago." The minister remained silent for a moment, trying to remember the name, but he did not succeed. Then he said in a calm voice that carried some caution, "If that is the case, then the matter is with a mysterious smile. I want you to bring me the story of the man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek." Shaheen froze for a moment, trying to understand the strange request. Then he said in surprise, "This is all you are asking for." The minister nodded and said firmly, "Yes, if you bring me this story, my daughter will be yours. This is my promise before God." Shaheen left the palace, his heart a mixture of joy and tension. He was happy that there was hope for achieving his dream, but he stood before one question that was raging in his mind. How will he find this mysterious story? When Shaheen returned home, he found his mother sitting near a window overlooking the narrow alley, waiting for him impatiently. Her looks were mixed with anxiety and anticipation, as if she was reading the answers in his steps before he spoke. As soon as he entered, she hurried. She asked him in a tense voice, "What did you do, Shaheen? Did the minister agree to the engagement?" Shaheen paused for a moment, his fatigue clearly evident, but a small smile appeared on his lips as he said, "Yes, mother, but he set a strange condition. He said that he did not want gold or silver, but rather asked me to bring him a story about a man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek." The mother felt a shock that made her freeze in place. She stared at her son with an eye followed by astonishment, then whispered as if she feared the answer, "The man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek. What is this story? Is this a true story? Or is he trying to get rid of you?" Shaheen approached her and extended his hand to calm her trembling hand and said in a reassuring tone, "Don't worry, mother. Sajid. No matter how strange or far-fetched it is, someone must know something about it. I will search until I reach the answer. The next morning, Shaheen began his journey in search of the story. His first step was to the old cafe in the distant alley where men used to gather to hear stories. And the stories found there an old man sitting in the middle of the council telling a story with enthusiastic gestures that attracted everyone around him. Shaheen waited patiently until the man finished speaking, then approached him and asked him politely, "Excuse me, sir, have you ever heard of the story of the man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek?" The man raised his eyebrows in surprise, then thought a little before answering, "I have never heard of this story before. Perhaps it is one of the old stories known to the elders or merchants of distant cities. You should look elsewhere." Shaheen did not despair and moved from one cafe to another, asking and searching among the stories and narrators, but the answer remained distant. His feet were exhausted from the walk, and his shoes were very full. When he reached the neighborhood mosque, he sat leaning on its stone wall, trying to gather his strength and look for a new plan. At that moment, the imam of the mosque passed by him. He was a dignified man wearing a white galabiya and a beard covering his face with majesty and serenity. The imam noticed Shaheen's exhausted state, so he stopped and asked him kindly, "What's wrong with you, my son? You look pale." As if you were carrying a great concern, Shaheen raised his eyes forward and decided to express what was in his heart. So he said in a voice full of hope, "Sir, I am looking for the story of the man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek. I have traveled from one cafe to another, and from one person to another to no avail. Have you heard of this story before?" The imam told his beard as he remembered something old. Then he said in a hesitant voice, "Yes, I heard about this story once, a long time ago. There was a merchant who was telling it here when he passed by the city. He said that it was an old story that dates back to a faraway country, perhaps Egypt or Iraq, but it is not common, and I do not know its details." Shaheen felt overwhelmed with joy, and a glimmer of hope began to appear to him. He said enthusiastically, "Thank you, sir. Even this simple gesture will help me. I will search in those countries until I find what I am looking for." The imam smiled gently and said, encouragingly, "May God grant you success, my son. Do not despair. As long as your heart is full of determination, you will reach what you want. Stories are hidden in hearts and streets, and you will find them if you continue searching." Shaheen returned home, his eyes shining with hope. But there were shadows of anxiety. She was in his heart. He approached his mother, who was waiting for him impatiently, and said to her in a voice full of determination, "Mom, I found someone who knows the story, but I have to go to Egypt. I heard that there is someone who has the details." Fear appeared on his mother's face, and her words seemed like a heavy sigh. "Egypt, you have never left the neighborhood, Shaheen. How will you travel alone to a faraway country like this?" Shaheen sighed deeply and answered in a stern tone that hid his inner anxiety. "Mom, nothing comes easy. Hasna deserves all this trouble. I will bear all the hardships for her." His mother froze for a moment, put her trembling hands on her face, and whispered in her heart sadly, May God curse that girl and her father. How did he make my son sacrifice everything? Then she sighed regretfully and asked God for forgiveness before raising her head to him and saying in a voice full of love and concern, "Perhaps there is good in traveling, my son. I ask God to grant you success and return you to me safely." Because she was a poor mother who did not have much, she sought refuge with her neighbor. She borrowed some money from her and then gathered for Shaheen provisions for the road: some dried figs, bread that would last him for days, and a small bundle of clothes. She gave him everything she could and said, while trying to hide her tears behind a faint smile, "This is all I have, my son. Don't burden yourself beyond your capacity." Shaheen kissed her hand tenderly and said, "Do not be afraid, mother. I will be back soon." He left her, and his heart was heavy with a mixture of hope and pain, but he was determined to achieve his goal. When he arrived in Egypt after long days of hardship, he began to ask everyone he met about the man who sells walnuts and slaps his cheek in every city and village he passed through. The answer was the same: "We have not heard of this story." One day, while he was sitting in the shade of a tree eating a piece of dry bread, an old man wearing a tattered cloak approached him. Shaheen asked him about the story. Then the man sighed and said, "I heard about that man once many years ago. It was said that he lives in Basra. If you are looking for him, you should continue your journey there." The shock was harsh on Shaheen, and the road stretched before him endlessly, but he controlled himself and said in his heart, "No matter how long the road is, I will not give up." Shaheen continued his way toward Basra through the deserts again until he came across a small oasis surrounded by palm trees. The owner of the oasis welcomed him with a friendly smile and offered him a bunch of dates and a water skin of cold water. Shaheen sat to catch his breath, but he did not stay long as a sandstorm blew and almost swallowed him. After losing hope, he came across a caravan of travelers who saved him and carried him with them to the nearest city. He thanked God for his salvation and continued walking with determination despite the exhaustion. After long days of suffering, Shaheen finally arrived in Basra. He entered the big market, where the noise of the merchants and the crowding of the people filled the air. He wandered between the shops, amazed by the variety of goods coming from India and Sindh. While he was moving, a cart full of nuts caught his attention. He approached it to find the seller weighing the nuts for the customers, but whenever someone paid him money, he shouted at him and slapped his cheek. Shaheen stood in amazement and said to himself, "This is the man I am looking for." He approached the seller and asked him about the price of the nuts. The seller answered in a strange voice, "A pound," and slapped him. Shaheen said to him, "I have crossed the deserts and come from far away to hear your story. For God's sake, tell me." But the seller, who seemed upset, refused and said in a stern tone, "If you want my story, you have to come to me with the story of the blacksmith who struck him and then left." Shaheen felt the pain, but he did not lose hope. "I will search for this story too, even if it costs me my life," he said before leaving. His journey had become more mysterious and difficult, but he knew that the end was worth it. One day, while he was walking, exhausted by the journey, he saw from afar a large city with towering walls and lively movement. When he reached its gates, he felt a sense of reassurance, as if it were a temporary refuge that would restore his strength. Shaheen entered the vast market and found himself in the middle of a sea of goods, the voices of merchants and the clamor of buyers. The shiny mirrors, silk fabrics, and spices coming from all corners of the earth made him feel dazed, but he was focused on his goal. He wandered among the shops, searching with his eyes for any sign of the man who had come for him. At the edge of the market, he noticed a shop that was different from the rest. In front of it were horses tied up, and the sound of a hammer echoed from inside. He approached with hesitant steps to find a blacksmith working with intense concentration, striking the anvil, then rushing into his shop after each strike. The blacksmith seemed strange, so Shaheen smiled to himself and said, "This is the man I am looking for." He walked towards him with confident steps and said in a voice filled with hope, "Oh, blacksmith, I have come from a distant country, crossing deserts and mountains. In search of you, please tell me your story." The blacksmith raised his head and looked at Shaheen with scrutinizing eyes before saying, "Wait until I finish my work." Then he hit the hammer with one last force and put it aside before entering the bottom of the shop. He returned after a few minutes with a cautious expression on his face. He said, "Why do you care about a story? What good would it do you to know it?" Shaheen replied insistently, "I have traveled long distances for you, and all I ask is to know your story. It is not curiosity, but necessity." The blacksmith pondered him for a few moments before returning inside again, leaving Shaheen standing in confusion. When he returned, he said to him in a mysterious tone, "My story is not an easy matter. If you want to hear it, go first and bring me the story of the man who breaks rubies with a pestle." Shaheen stared at him in astonishment and said, "Breaks rubies? Is there anyone who can do that?" The blacksmith smiled coldly and said, "Yes, there is someone who can. Look for him, and you will find me waiting for you." Shaheen took a step back, confusion looming over his features. He did not know if he should continue or retreat, but he said to himself, "If I return now, people will not talk about what I went through, but only about my failure. I will continue on my path, no matter the cost." Shaheen began his journey again, searching for the man who breaks rubies with a pestle. But he was walking as if he was walking in a closed circle between cities and villages, asking everyone without finding an answer. One day, while he was wandering in one of the crowded markets, he heard talk about a merchant ship heading to India, the land of wonders. He approached one of the merchants and asked him, "Do you know anything about the man who breaks rubies with a pestle?" The merchant smiled coldly and said, "I have never heard of this person, but I am on my way to India, the land of wonders. If you want to sail with me, the opportunities are available." Weeks passed as if they were ages, and finally the land appeared to him. India was that country that he had heard about in stories, more beautiful and wonderful than he had imagined. Shaheen got off the ship to find himself in a completely different world. The bright colors, the fragrant smells, the loud sounds, all came together to create a vibrant painting. He began to wander between the cities. The villagers walk in narrow streets crowded with passers-by, where he hears the echo of laughter and the shouts of merchants everywhere. And while he was walking, he saw a royal palace looming on the horizon, towering as if it was guarding the whole city. He walked towards the big market that was bustling with life, where the voices of the vendors mixed with the music of the itinerant musicians. While he was moving between the shops, his feet led him to a narrow alley filled with goldsmiths' tools. The place was crowded with luxury goods and the finest precious stones that caught the eye. And in the corner of the alley, his attention was caught by a merchant standing in front of a huge display table, in the middle of which was a large, shiny red ruby like a pigeon's egg. But the strange thing is that everyone was moving away from it as if it carried a curse. Two men, strangers to the city, came forward and began to bid on the ruby. The offer was increasing quickly, until one of them stopped at 10,000 dinars. Then the merchant held the ruby firmly and put it in a huge golden pestle. And to everyone's amazement, he began to break it with successive blows, until it turned into fine red dust. Shaheen stood in amazement as he stared at the scene that seemed to him like it was from another world. He muttered to himself, "This is the man I am looking for. He is the one who breaks the ruby." He watched him silently, contemplating his skill in turning rare stones into dust without hesitation. It was what held a great secret that no one knew. After the merchant finished his work, he gathered his things and took them to his nearby palace. Shaheen followed his steps silently. Shaheen stood in front of the luxurious gate and hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. The maid opened the door and led him into the guest hall. The hall was a work of art. Its walls were decorated with the finest engravings, and the ceilings were studded with gold. Shaheen sat in amazement, contemplating the place that seemed to him like a dream palace. After a while, the owner of the palace entered, a man of majesty and dignity, and greeted him warmly. When he knew that Shaheen was a stranger to the city, he immediately ordered the preparation of 100 full meals. Shaheen sat at the table decorated with dishes he had never seen before, and began eating quietly while his mind was preoccupied. As he told his story, Shaheen raised his head and said, "Sir, I have crossed deserts and seas, and gone on a long and arduous journey in search of you. The reason was a strange condition the minister set for me. It turned my life upside down. All I want now is to hear your story." The merchant listened intently to Shaheen, his eyes full of interest and anticipation. When Shaheen finished telling his story, the merchant smiled a calm smile and said in a voice full of wisdom, "I admire your courage and your unwavering determination. I will tell you my story, but do not rush to judge." Then the merchant began his talk. "I was once the son of the chief merchant, born into a house full of wealth. But I was too young to understand anything about the world. I grew up in a shell of isolation, far from people and from the worries of life, until some friends came who tempted me with the joys of life, a life full of fun and debauchery. We began to stay up late together, living in a world of food, drink, and indulgence. I spent everything I had for my own pleasure, until the day came when I met a beautiful slave girl, so I married her. As time passed, I saw how money began to decrease and how crises loomed on the horizon. I spent on my friends who praised me and told me that I was generous. Money began to run out quickly, and I lost control. I borrowed from here and there and was unable to pay the debts until I mortgaged my orchard. When it was all over, I realized that greed was the reason for my destruction. I thought that money would bring me happiness, but I discovered in the end that nothing lasts. The merchant was silent for a moment, then continued. One night, I was sitting with my friends in the city cafe. It was the moment when I felt the most embarrassed in my life. My pocket was empty, so much so that I was unable to pay the food bill. I stood up and said to them, "You pay this time. I have no money." When I saw the change in their faces and how they began to avoid looking into my eyes, I understood at that moment that they had started to see me as a stranger. Their talk with me became harsh, and no one cared about me anymore. Everyone moved away, as if I had become a burden they did not want to bear. Then the merchant looked up at Shaheen, as if he wanted to make him feel every word. As for the house, the day came when my wife approached me and said in a sharp voice, "We no longer have anything. If you cannot arrange the money soon." It was like a sword on my heart. I said to her, while in great pain, "I have never been short on you. Is this my punishment? Will God make a way out for me?" But I was selling everything I had left, furniture, carpets, in order to live on what remained. Yet the days only grew darker. One day, I returned home and found that my wife had left. She took all her clothes and belongings and went to her father's house. As for my friends, who used to fill the place before, they had disappeared. They abandoned me in my ordeal as if they had never been in my life. At that moment, I knew that I had become alone. I wished for someone to help me, but no one stood by me except my cousin, a girl of extreme beauty and a sober mind. I knew she had been watching me from afar, cautiously, as if she saw what I did not see. She told me firmly, "Stay away from your bad friends. You will not find any of them in times of hardship." But as usual, I ignored her advice. The merchant stopped, and sad memories accumulated in his eyes before he resumed speaking in a tone full of pain. "I thought about leaving this country that once called me its master, but today I have nothing. I have become an outcast, and the city that once belonged to me has begun to reject me." Then Sheikh Mukhtar appeared, my father's friend, a man everyone respected for his knowledge and faith. He asked me calmly, "Is it true what is said about your intention to sell the palace and leave?" I lowered my head and answered, "Yes, it is true." The sheikh sighed and said, "How can you sell the palace where your father and grandfather lived? This is unjust. By God, if I were in your place, I would not dare to do this. Fire leaves nothing but ashes, and your death is easier than such a life." The merchant was deeply affected by the sheikh's words, as if they were penetrating his heart and mind. He left the city lost, not knowing where to go. His feet took him to a place far from everyone. Suddenly, he found himself in front of an old well. At that moment, he felt a deadly current pulling his soul away, so he thought about getting rid of himself, but he discovered that the well was full of mud. He screamed inside, "I want to die," but even death escaped from him. Then he looked around and saw a dark crypt. He entered it, and in the wall he found something shiny. He killed with trembling hands, and behold, it was a red ruby shining in his hands. He could not believe what he saw. He began to search the place carefully, as if he had discovered a buried treasure. The merchant continued, as if he was living that moment again. Days passed, and I became rich again, thanks to that ruby. I filled the markets with gold and silver until I stored it in my safes. I no longer mixed with anyone except my cousin, who was always by my side in the most difficult moments. As for my friends, I forgot them, just as they forgot about me in my time of distress. When they heard about my sudden wealth, they came to me. They apologized, but I didn't need them. I took out a SAA of rubies and pounded it in the pestle until it turned to dust, and threw it at them, saying, "This is what you deserve." The merchant stopped, then added in a calm but confident voice, "Then my wife came to me carrying gifts, but I threw her out and divorced her, and threw the ruby dust in her face. After that, she married my cousin, who was always by my side, and carried with her all the stories I went through. And this is the end, Mr. Shaheen." The merchant stood up and said, "Take this money. Here are 2 Ahil SAA of rubies. Use it in your new life path. Go back to your country and marry the girl you love. This money will help you start a new business that will guarantee you an income to spend on your wife." Shaheen thanked the merchant sincerely and took the money, then said goodbye and set off on his way to Basra. Shaheen bought a camel and water and continued his journey through the vast desert. And after a long journey, he finally arrived in Basra, where he went to the blacksmith's shop. He greeted him and said, "I have returned, and I have the story of the owner of the ruby." The blacksmith was happy and answered, "Come on, let's sit down and tell me about it. I am eager to hear what you have brought." Shaheen sat down and began to tell him about the merchant who helped him, and how the merchant gave him the ruby and advised him to marry the girl he loved and started a new business. The blacksmith listened to him while shaking his head in astonishment. When Shaheen finished reciting, the blacksmith said, "That story is wonderful, but it is no less strange than my story, because you do not know what I have been through." Then the blacksmith began to tell his story, saying, "I am a blacksmith, as were my father and grandfather before me. I have advanced in my profession until I became the most trustworthy blacksmith in this country. I had a private cabin at the end of my shop, where I used to hide from work. There was a small window through which sunlight entered." The blacksmith continued, saying, "One day, while I was sitting in his cabin, something caught my attention. Through the window, I saw a white dove. I had never seen anything like it in my life. It was purer and more beautiful than anything else. I approached it and held its feet, but suddenly it flew with me in the air. I did not understand. How did this happen, and how was the pigeon able to carry my body? I closed my eyes and could not believe what was happening to me. When I opened them, I found myself in front of a huge palace, shining with gold and beautiful decorations. I stood in amazement, reviewing the beauty of the place and the gilded windows that adorned the walls. The blacksmith said, while I was in the midst of my amazement, the door of the large palace opened, and guards carrying swords came out of it. And in front of them was a musical choir playing wonderful tunes. I stood in front of a horse-drawn carriage. Then one of the servants opened the door for me and invited me to enter. I entered the carriage, and it took me until I reached a marble bathroom where the palace servants received me and took me to a hot tub where they changed my dirty clothes and cleaned my body of dirt. Then a barber came and shaved my hair. After that, I put on the finest silk clothes, and they decorated me with gold, until I became like the sons of sultans. Then the guards led me to a large hall where people lined up in 2 rows chanting my name and pointed to me to sit on a golden throne. I was in a state I could not believe. Then a beautiful woman entered, and at that moment an old sheikh entered and held my Quran was revealed to this woman amidst the people's cheers. Long live the Sultan! Long live the Sultan! The blacksmith said, "At that moment, I was extremely confused, for everything was very strange to me. I asked the guard who was standing beside me about what was happening. He told me, in our customs, if the Sultan dies, we all leave the palace, and the first person we see, we appoint him to become the new Sultan and marry the Sultan's widow." Then I understood and said to myself, I was one of the simple blacksmiths. Then I became a S. Days passed, and I was immersed in luxury. I had everything I had ever wished for. My wife gave birth to children, and there was a beautiful baby girl. But instead of being grateful to God for this blessing, I began to act arrogantly and became conceited. One day, during a hunting trip, I passed by the minister's orchard. I liked the orchard very much and wanted to add it to my orchard. This would not happen unless I married the minister's daughter. I got off my horse and asked him for her hand. The minister immediately agreed and said, "This is your wife. Congratulations." We began preparing for the wedding, but one day my wife came to me and asked me, "Are you really going to get married?" I answered her in the affirmative. Then she started arguing with me, so I got angry and raised my hand and hit her. So her tears streamed down her face, and she said to me, "A day will come when you will regret what you did." I answered her angrily, "Nothing can happen to me. I am the Sultan." But at that moment, the same dove that had carried me to the palace caught my attention. Greed made me angry, and I said to myself, if it had carried me before to this palace, perhaps now it will take me to India, where there is gold and diamonds. I grabbed the dove and closed my eyes. When I opened them, I found myself in my shop, wearing an old apron and with a lot of dirt on my body. I could not believe what I saw and felt terrified. I ran around the shop, wishing that the dove would return and take me there again. I did not want a kingdom or gold. I only wished to see my wife and children again. Shaheen said, "Your story is truly very strange, but this is the reward for greed and the consequences that befall everyone who covets what is not his. I invite you to forget the dove, for it will not return, for every person has his share in this life. What happened to you is your destiny. Get up and improve yourself. Perhaps God will compensate you with something better than what you lost." The blacksmith said, "I will follow your advice and start over. I will continue my work and repent of my arrogance." When the blacksmith said goodbye to Shah, he set off on his way, carrying the ruby, determined to improve his condition. Shahin arrived after a long journey to the city, where he worked as a walnut seller. He found people lined up asking for walnuts. He approached the seller and said, "Do you remember me?" The seller began to remember him and said, "It has been a long time, but I remember your face now." Shahin said, "I am the one who came to you before to ask you about your story. You stipulated that I bring the story of the blacksmith who strikes his blow and goes to the bottom of his shop." The seller replied, "Yes, I remember you now, but this story has been going on for months. Tell me what happened to the blacksmith, for I am eager to hear his story." Shahin began to narrate what happened to the blacksmith and the dove that carried him to the palace. When he finished the story, the walnut seller said, "What an amazing story! But what happened to me was even more amazing." The seller said, "My son, I am the son of a great merchant, one of the country's notables. One day my father fell ill, and some time passed. Then he died, leaving me and my brother a large inheritance of land and shops. The inheritance was divided between us, each of us getting his own property. But unlike my brother, I was kind-hearted and honest in a world full of deceit and trickery. One day, I got to know a group of merchants' sons who were my age. They loved staying up late and would meet at the house of one of them, which his father had given him. I liked those evenings and the atmosphere full of singing and dancing of the concubines. At first I would visit them from time to time, but I soon got used to that atmosphere. I started going to them every night, and in the morning I would not open my shop and would sleep until noon. Then I would eat a light meal, and then go to my friends carrying gifts for the concubines. I continued in this way for a while, spending money without thinking. When the gold I had ran out, I decided to use the rest of my property, so I started selling some of the shops, and I did not check on my livelihood, but I was content with sleeping. As time passed, the shops began to empty out, so I sold them one by one until I lost everything. One day, I went to my friends for a night out, but they looked at me sharply and said, "Where are the party supplies?" I told them I no longer had money. They replied, "You are not in a place where you can come without money. Get out of here and don't think about coming back." I went to my brother, but he refused to help me. I had nothing but an empty house with a mat to sleep on and a tin to eat from. I was in severe pain and was unable to open my eyes from the intensity of hunger. At that time, I sat under a wall, and my brother saw me as if he had not seen me. Next to me was a poor woman sitting with her daughter. She shouted at me and said, "Don't let despair kill you. Go to the forest and look for work, as it makes a person forget his pain." I listened to her words despite the fatigue that was eating me away. I dragged my tired feet and went to the forest. I began to collect branches, and while I was moving, an ugly-looking man appeared to me and said, "Stay away from this place. This is the land of the jinn." Fear took hold of me, so I told him what had happened to me with my friends. He looked at me and said, "You deserve it. What happened to you is the result of someone who does not think with his mind." Then he suddenly disappeared, but after a while he returned carrying a trumpet, and said to me, "Blow into it, and your livelihood will come to you." I took the trumpet and blew into it, and suddenly I saw pieces of gold falling under my feet. I could not believe what I saw. I started blowing into it again, and suddenly more gold fell in front of me. I carried the gold to the market and sold it. I bought new clothes, food, and utensils with the money, and I brought the poor woman and her daughter to my house and told her, "From today on, you will not sleep in the street. This is your home, and I will marry your daughter." After a while, the business began to expand. I worked with my wife in the store, and everyone loved us. It did not take long for my business to flourish, and I returned to regain what I had lost. In just 1 year, I had 5 shops selling perfumes and silk, and I regained my father's estate. I began to move around in a procession full of guards and servants. I began to do good and distribute food until there was no longer a poor or hungry person in the city. The day came when my brother came to visit me, bearing gifts, and he told me, "I have lost my mother and my children. I saw your condition and how you now have money. Tell me the secret of your wealth." Then I revealed my secret to him. The next morning, I went to look for the trumpet that the genie had given me, but I did not find it. When I asked my brother about it, he expelled me harshly. My brother began to open shops similar to Kenny's, and my business profits decreased. I lost everything. I could no longer pay the servants' wages, so I was forced to sell the horses and donkeys. I began to walk on my feet. I felt sorry for myself and was afraid to return to a life of poverty. I returned to the genie and moved the branch from its place. The ugly man appeared again and asked me about the reason for my return. I told him my story with my brother. He extended a new trumpet to me and said, "Don't come back here again." As soon as I blew into it, the nuts began to fall. I began to sell them in the market, but, as had happened before, the nuts became plentiful in the city, and their price became cheap. So I sold the nuts, and was slapped on my cheek because I did not learn from my mistakes. Therefore, I deserve to be slapped every day as a punishment for my foolishness. Shahin was surprised by the story and said, "What a story! Strange, but it's okay. At least you have a good wife and you didn't lose everything." Then he took a bag of nuts and put it on his camel and said goodbye to the seller. Then he started walking back to his country, feeling indescribable joy. After a long journey through cities and narrow alleys, he finally arrived in his country and stopped in front of his house. Shahin knocked on the door, and when his mother saw him, she hugged him tightly. She did not finish. She was hiding her joy, which was beyond description, as if she had not found a place on earth or in heaven that would suffice for her joy. She said to him, "My son, it has been a long time since you were absent, and the situation was worse than you can imagine. I almost lost hope in your return." Shahin answered her, saying, "We will not be separated from you again, mother." Then he opened his bag and took out for her the gifts and perfumes he had brought from India, Baghdad, and Basra. He showed her the ruby he had brought. The mother was surprised by the abundance of blessings and gifts he had brought. The next day, Shahin called the builders to expand the house, turning it into a 3-story palace, and decorated it with the most luxurious carpets and the most beautiful furniture. And there were servants and attendants. Then Shahin opened a large shop to sell spices, and he also bought a ship to bring him goods from India. His condition improved greatly, to the point that his neighbors did not recognize him. After that, he decided to go to the minister's house, so he rode in a large procession. When he arrived, the minister was surprised to see him, and said in astonishment, "What brought you here, my son?" Shahin answered, "I am the one who proposed to Hasna." He mentioned the story of the walnut seller who was slapping his cheek. He continued, "I have brought you this bag of walnuts from him, which is your daughter's dowry." The minister sat next to his daughter Hasna, and Shahin began to tell them the details of his journeys across the wilderness and seas until he finally arrived in India. The story that the minister expected was not one story, but rather about 3 adventures, each carrying lessons and morals. When Shahin finished telling his story, the minister said, "I asked you for this story in order to see the extent of your love for my daughter. I swore that I would not hand her over except to someone who knows her worth. You have proven your worth despite all the difficulties you faced, as the deserts and mountains did not prevent you from striving." Behind the love of Hasna, Shahin said with sincerity, "Your daughter is in my heart, and whatever you ask of me, you will find." The minister replied, "There is no doubt about that, my son." After a week, grand celebrations were held in the palace of the merchant Shahin. People began to tell his story and say that he discovered a huge treasure in the desert after he had been poor and destitute, but they did not know that the real treasure he obtained was patience and perseverance in the pursuit of success. The poor Shahin had a dream one night, so he decided to strive to achieve his dream. May God reward him with abundant goodness. Until we meet again in a new video, may you be in God's care.